afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. As always, on the fourth Wednesday of the month, I'm joined by Mark LaBarr, conservation biologist for Audubon, Vermont. Great to see you.
Always great to be here.
Now, today we're going to be talking about Audubon's new climate change report.
Yes, the big climate change report. It came out earlier this month. Basically a report looking at climate change and how the climate's going to change and what birds are going to potentially do in reaction to the changing climate over the next 80 years or so.
Now, it's important to point out that this report was years in the making.
Yes. The data analysis itself was 7 years, just to put all of the different pieces together. But the two main bird data pools that they were working off of were the Christmas bird count, one of them, which is more than 100 years old. Citizen science has, folks out there collecting this data, and so it's great to see this data being used. The other one is the breeding bird survey, which has been running since the 1960s. And so this data, along with meteorological data, were all pulled together way beyond me, how they fit all the pieces together. But they were able to pull together some models and then put it out in this climate change report. Mm-hmm. I think probably the best way to kind of introduce it is a short video that National Audubon has put on their website that kind of sums that up. So I thought we would start with that.
Okay, great. Let's take a look.
Throughout our history, we've looked to birds as messengers. They tell us when seasons are changing. They tell us stories that help us understand our own. And they welcome every morning with their beautiful songs. Now they have an urgent message about our changing world. Scientists from the National Audubon Society have analyzed the observations of thousands of bird watchers and information from leading climate scientists. And they've reached a clear conclusion. Birds are on the move in response to global warming. Gary Langham, chief scientist at Audubon, says the message is stark and clear.
It's an urgent message. Nearly half of the bird species in the United States and Canada are seriously threatened by climate change. And if nothing is done to abate this threat, many of the bird species we love could disappear forever.
Every bird species is uniquely adapted to its surroundings, including temperature, precipitation, and changing seasons. But when rising greenhouse gases change the climate, the conditions on which birds depend are thrown into disarray. Birds will find themselves displaced from their homes. Many of the birds that will be threatened include some of our most familiar and beloved species: the bald eagle, the brown pelican, the burrowing owl, the common loon, the Baltimore oriole, and the Allen's hummingbird. The survival of these birds is in question.
Being a bird is really hard. Each bird species is finely tuned to a set of environmental conditions so that everything about its physiology, its behavior, and its genetics allows it to be successful in that environment.
But when those fundamentals of the environment begin to shift, it can be a catastrophe for birds like the Allen's hummingbird. Today, it breeds along the Pacific coast in California and Oregon. If global warming intensifies, however, its range will shrink dramatically by the year 2050, and even more drastically by 2080, when 93% of its breeding range could be gone. The birds may be forced to look for habitat in unfamiliar places far from the coast, where they will face new competition for limited food and resources. And they might find new predators or fierce competitors that make it impossible to survive in new locations. It's a serious message that we've been given, from birds and from science. But there are also answers on how we can help.
The broader question is, what can we do about it? The Audubon report tells us two things that we need to do right now. The first is to reduce carbon pollution that causes global warming. And the second is to protect those places that the birds need today and will need in the future.
We know that when we give nature half a chance, it is resilient. We know which birds to focus on and where they need our help. There is a role for all of us to play in making sure the worst effects of global warming don't come to pass.
The important thing is to take action. There's something everyone can do in their individual lives and in their communities to make it a better place for birds and for people.
Join us at audubon.org/climate to learn more and take action today.
Well, that's interesting information and a little alarming.
It is. You know, we know that climate change is happening, and we know that even looking at things that have happened over the past, you know, 2 to 3 decades, you know, range expansion of some of the birds like cardinals and tufted titmouse, we know that birds move around like this. So it is, and there are going to be some losers, and there are going to be probably some birds that, you know, potentially benefit from this as well. Audubon has a web page that folks can go to, and you know, just type in Audubon climate change, and it talks about the study and what may happen to some of these bird species. You can actually go online. There's a list of birds that are kind of the highlighted birds, the ones that are at most risk. And you can learn about them and how their climates change. And you can then almost break it down and take a look at individual regions and even break it down to the state level. So the web page allows you to go, and there's you know, it brings you to an image. If you're looking at birds close to you, you'll see the United States, and it'll bring up the image of what we call the Atlantic Flyway. That's the East Coast. That's the area where we work. That's that blue side there, and you can see there are other regions. If you click on that Atlantic Flyway, it brings you down specifically to that. You can see on the left-hand side there's a list of all the states. You click on Vermont, and it'll bring you right down to Vermont, and then you can scroll through a list of birds that are potentially threatened, or what this study shows are potentially threatened. So you can get in there and you can get and explore this information on the webpage, as well as a lot of the questions about the study.
So you can find birds you're interested in.
Right, right. And to use a couple of examples, one of the birds, as far as what could potentially happen to bird species, we'll start with a bird called the wood thrush. This is a bird many people are familiar with. It's in the thrush family with the robins, has that, you know, the hermit thrush is the state bird. This is its cousin. And when you look at it, the way that the web page and the way that the maps in the web page work is you can actually go to see what their population and their range is right now. Now you can see here that big yellow splotch. That's pretty much the breeding range of the wood thrush at year 2000. And this data is determined in large parts from that BBS, that Breeding Bird Survey data. If we move on to 2050, you can slowly see that that range is beginning to dissipate and is beginning to shift north. And by 2080, you can see that a large portion of that bird's population has shifted north. Now, what's interesting here is, as far as Vermont's concerned, we continue to remain a stronghold for this bird. And so we, you know, it's important when we put that in context that, you know, as we look at our forests, that we really, and our grasslands and our shrublands, that we want to really work hard to maintain those habitat types, because birds may move, but we can become as important, if not more important, for some species.
So it's not all bad news.
It's not all bad news, no. And that's an example of a changing range where Vermont, as far as Vermont is concerned, still is a good, you know, the forest structure and the climate is good for wood thrushes. For some of the southern states, not so good. A bird that may be impacted by this, and a bird that we hear in our forests all the time, the black-throated blue warbler. As you can see, its name, you know, identifies its plumage. It's got that nice black throat and that blue back. This is a bird that we could lose over the course of the next 80 years. That, you know, again, here's the range map. These range maps are a little bit more conservative. If you go in and you start looking at these maps, you might notice that they're not the same as, say, your bird guide. But they are based on the Breeding Bird Survey, so they're a little more conservative. But you can see the range of this bird includes Vermont. This is a common bird. But by 2080, this bird has shifted far enough north that it is no longer present in the Vermont forests. So this is a situation where we may lose this species from the state of Vermont.
Well, that's not good to see, but Are there other scenarios that could happen?
Sure. Another one is the white-throated sparrow. Now, this is a species which breeds here. We've had this bird on our program many, many times. Poor Will Peabody, or if you're above the border, oh, Canada, Canada, Canada. And this bird actually doesn't leave the state, but what'll happen is we're going to see it in a different fashion. So here we are at 2000, and you can see that yellow on the top and the blue on the bottom. The blue is the winter range, the yellow's on the top.
Okay.
And you can see that right now in 2000, these birds are breeding in Vermont. By 2080, everything shifts north. So the breeding population moves north, but you can still see that we have white-throated sparrows as a winter bird here in the state. So we don't lose it, but we just might not be hearing its song. We might be seeing it under our feeders instead.
Well, what are some of the other species that may be affected in Vermont, and what can we do?
Well, it's interesting, you know, in that short video it showed the common loon, and in that video it showed the, you know, climate change basically drying up that lake. And in Vermont it may be different. The loon species may not be here. We may lose the common loon, but only because, you know, when you look at the eastern United States, there are plenty of lakes and bodies of water down in South Carolina and Georgia, and yet loons don't take advantage of those sites. As Vermont becomes more like those other states, the birds will shift. We'll still have those lakes and ponds, but the birds will shift north. A bird such as the hooded warbler, which is a southern warbler species, may become a regular resident here in Vermont as its breeding population shifts north. So, you know, there's lots of different changes that can go on. Birds that we might lose includes the chestnut-sided warbler, and there's even predictions that common raven may no longer stay here in Vermont. A lot of it depends on the resiliency of the birds and whether they stay and whether they can survive, or whether they stay and they can't. And I think, you know, with climate change, there's a couple things. Obviously, it's in the news. Everybody knows, you know, some of the simple things: fluorescent lighting, reduce your travel time, reduce your carbon footprint. That's going to be beneficial. But also, you know, citizen science has been a big component to this, and so continuing to monitor birds over time to see how these models work is also important. And then again, protecting the current habitats that we have to make those habitats resilient so that as birds transition maybe through them or towards them or out of them, we still supply them with what they need as their ranges expand or shrink.
Does that mean that maybe perhaps it might be suggested that we feed birds longer at the feeder, or?
Yeah, something like that could be. Although, you know, if it gets warm enough, you know, winter bird feeding may have a completely different take on things. So who knows? And again, these are all predictions, as is climate change in itself. We're not quite sure what happens, but there could be a lot of things. But again, keeping those habitats viable for birds right now and into the future is really important.
And so, you know, people say, well, there's no such thing as global warming. You can't convince me that that's happening.
You know, that's a tough one. The bulk of the science is in the you know, the area that some kind of climate change is happening, and the climate is changing. And a lot of it points to us humans as being a factor in that. You know, I think that we know that it's happening. We can see that it's going to continue to happen. And so how we look at it and how we adjust to it is really going to impact, you know, how not only these bird species are affected, but the human population as well.
Well, it is, you know, that story started off talking about the fact that birds are really sort of a messenger.
The canary in the coal mine.
Right.
You know, that was always, and that was, you know, something they brought a bird into the mine to test for environmental conditions, and in many respects this is the same. I think you even did a story on it when the piece came out.
I did last week, yeah, a couple weeks ago.
It's, you know, it's been a big thing. The web page does a great job in answering a lot of questions about the study and in demonstrating some of the models. So I encourage folks to get to that, you know, go to the website and check it out for themselves.
Yeah, it's very interesting reading.
Yes.
All right, well, if you have a bird-related question, you can pass it along to Mark. You can write to him at Audubon, Vermont, 255 Sherman Hollow Road in Huntington. The zip code is 05462. You can also email your questions to Mark. His email address is mlabarr@audubon.org. Send Mark your questions, and he'll try to find the answers for you on an upcoming edition of Bird Notes. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence. you.